The BSA Conference 2011. Just before we begin, this is actually our most successful conference ever. We have over 1,000 delegates, which is a testament to the power and strength of British sociology. And this particular session, which has been co-organised with SAGE, is looking at British sociology, what's happened in Britain over the last 60 years. We're going to have like a fairly sort of like free-flowing session in some respects. John Urry, one of the speakers, and Chris Rojek will converse and discussing various themes that have existed in that time, and then we'll open up from questions from the floor. Both speakers here have a long history in sociology. John, I'm sure you'll know his particular work in areas such as power, regionalism, culture and tourism, and more lately work on mobility. And Chris, who's co-authored a book back in 1997 on touring cultures, again, an interest in leisure, celebrity, an excellent book on Frank Sinatra, if I remember correctly, will be the other person that will be developing this discussion about what we're doing. So I think I shall just hand it over to yourselves if you'd like to begin. Thank you very much.
Well, we haven't prepared anything, so we're just going to have an unstructured discussion. We've got some key themes that we want to go through. And then at the end of the session, there's going to be a question session from you. If you want to ask us any questions, there's going to be mics going around apparently after about 12 o'clock. I've known John for about 20 odd years, I think, and we did the Touring Cultures book in the 90s, which was actually a very pleasurable experience because John is very, very well ordered, and he's one of those people who does what he says he's going to do. If he says he's going to write a book and deliver it in June, on the whole he does. So it's been a pleasure to work with John and a pleasure to learn from John over the years. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with John because the themes that he takes on are often very different. Complexity theory then moves on to climate, automobilities, and so on. He's got a very lively mind and has covered a lot of ground. With regard to our discussion today, though, what we're going to start with is an obvious question. It's a definitional one. Is it right to say that there is a British sociology, John?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I think there's been an interesting effort to generate some British debates, but to a significant extent that's been an attempt to wrest certain topics and issues out of American domination. When I first started reading sociology books, they were almost all American. And so it's kind of interesting to think that there was a sort of, a sort of global social science some decades ago, shall we say. And so it's interesting to think on that. And so one of the things that happened, I think, interestingly, in the 1960s, and I wasn't involved in this, there was a significant effort to develop a British tradition, especially around social class stratification and then in mobility, social mobility studies in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think to a significant extent that came to define a particular sort of notion of British social science, and in which there were important studies, particularly the so-called affluent worker studies, the studies of what were the forms and patterns of life being developed on relatively new public sector estates in the UK, and also other studies related to race of Rex and Robert Moore, who's in the audience. So the sort of interesting, but I think they were relatively specific, and there was also John Rex's effort to develop a kind of a particular take on social theory around a kind of so-called conflict model of society. But the take that then developed, and I think kind of during the 1970s was really striking, was the way in which a whole series of European figures, debates, controversies, debates around the nature of capitalism, the nature of class, the nature of the state, the so-called character of the modes of production and social formations, if people remember that literature. And then towards the end of that literature, or that period, the sort of contribution of the so-called Birmingham School, Stuart Hall, who's been referred to quite a bit in this conference already, was sort of seeking to develop a kind of a sort of resistant to American domination, more theoretical, but very much kind of drawing on and interpreting kind of a series of European thinkers and writers.
There was an odd insularity about that, though, because really the branding of British sociology at this period put class as one of the key things. And of course, as soon as we go to America and talk about class, it doesn't mean very much to them. They see it as a very English, British issue. The other thing, having been a student at Leicester in the 1970s, where I was taught that the greatest living sociologist was someone that nobody had heard of called Norbert Elias, there was a huge insularity about the debates. I mean, Birmingham was 40 miles away from Leicester, and yet we were never encouraged to go to Birmingham, and they were never encouraged to come to us. It was as if you had these little islands of activity in Britain where the actual discussion points, the nodes of discussion, were not developed. Was that the case?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to reflect upon the degree to which the patterns and practices of academic life did not presuppose lots of travel.
Yes.
And lots of meetings. There were, as you rightly say, these different departments. Actually, what happened in departments mattered an awful lot. Yeah. And there were often departments were sites of incredible sort of contestation for the soul of the department, and it really mattered, you know, how many classes or courses there were in topic X rather than topic Y and so on. And I think and also I think the BSA conferences were quite interesting because there was lots of contestation about the topics of those conferences, and in which because this was the one, well, maybe it was the one point in the year where people travelled to some exotic location and met. And actually, interestingly, the size of those conferences were pretty big. There were hundreds of people. I remember going to one on the cultural turn in the late 1970s, and it was absolutely, I can't remember where it was now, but it was hugely, it was huge. But that was sort of because that was the one time you got to visit other places, and it really mattered who was going to give the keynote addresses.
There were interesting British distinctions of class there, though, because there was a degree of stratification within that whole process, where the National Deviancy Council, for example, that's where you went if you were a really cutting-edge sociologist. You didn't really go to the BSA. Lots of distinctions and layers in all of that process, I feel. Did you see that as well?
Yeah, I wasn't part of that, and. Yeah, I don't think there were very many smaller groups, though. The York Deviancy Symposium was a kind of interesting example. But there weren't the sort of ESRC type study groups and the proliferation of many other study groups. There was more the sort of the big annual conference.
You can see that either as a maturity in the subject or the closing of the iron cage, because now these groups today often don't talk to each other. The globalization group has their meeting and the culture group has their meeting. And the language, although we use the same language, we don't actually get together that much. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, no, that's definitely correct. I don't think that's a huge problem actually in the UK because it's a smallish country, and actually because of things like trains, you can get from one place in England at least to another place, and maybe in Scotland as well. So the proliferation of lots of different meetings I don't think, and they kind of overlap a certain amount and so on. So I'm slightly less bothered by that. And there are actually, I don't recollect any discussions about the World Congress of Sociology, which I think is quite an important phenomenon that I started going to in the mid-1980s in Delhi, the first one I went to, and also the then development of a European Sociological Association in the 1990s. So there are these different forms. But maybe we should also think a little bit about the kind of the topics as well that were being...
Well, my next question was going to be, in this hive of activity in the 60s and 70s, when sociology was in many ways a banner subject, people were really flocking to it. Was there a real sense of a project? I mean, in the Birmingham School Hall used the term project often in terms of what they were doing in the 70s. I know it wasn't shared throughout the UK by any means, but were sociologists at that time following an agenda where they thought they were going to have a particular kind of relevance, or what were they up to in terms of their self-image?
Yes. Yeah, it was definitely a controversial subject to choose to study. Indeed, in a way, it's kind of hard to believe this, but I read economics at university, and even reading economics was sort of seen as a very dangerous and odd thing to be doing. So then turning into a sociologist was even odder, and it was a sort of kind of almost like a lifestyle commitment. So there was something much more contested than I guess now it's yet another sort of option on the UCAS forms and so on. So I think the significance of the choice was pretty interesting. And also, of course, very difficult often to justify in universities. Often the universities were highly contestatory and difficult. It was, maybe there's parallels now, but it sort of was more controversial, much more controversial a subject, and much less tied into other disciplines. Actually, that's one of the things that's interesting. It was much less. When the cuts came in the Thatcher years, I remember Ray Powell advocating what he called the spaghetti strategy, which was to get sociology intertwined like a string of spaghetti with lots of other departments and disciplines and activities and so on, so as to make it much harder to kind of pull out this one spaghetti strand. So that was interesting issue to do with the sort of its place, and obviously most of those aspects have now pretty well disappeared.
You also, it came through in Laurie's speech yesterday, you were also getting people actually appointed to lectureships in sociology who'd never studied the subject, who hadn't really any background in the subject, but just a declared interest in the subject. In a sense, sociology in this country has emerged from a kind of misfit culture, hasn't it?
Yeah, I sort of take what Laurie says there with a pinch of salt, really. I don't think that wasn't my experience. But it is true that many of the people appointed didn't have first degrees in the subject, but that actually has continued. I don't think that's actually so distinct. There were also, contrary to Laurie's story, plenty of applicants for jobs and plenty of intense competition for jobs in the early 70s, certainly when I knew anything about those sorts of processes. So it wasn't quite, well, I didn't think it was quite right. And in a way, there were lots of different routes in. And of course, there had been very few departments, as we, LSE and Leicester, I suppose, were the only two. And I think a little bit Hull, where Tony Giddens was a student, were the only places where sort of significant numbers of sociology graduates were being produced. I didn't really know anything about that at the time.
I'm going to get into trouble for this train of thought because the end question I'm going to put to you is, why are there no great British social theorists?
Right.
But to get there, Brian Turner, who's also a friend of mine, wrote an article in TCS some time ago and has talked to me about this before. He says that what's distinctive about British sociology is not so much the affluent worker studies or empirical work. What British sociology has done, he says, in the post-war period, has imported continental European philosophy and social theory, commented on it, synthesized it, and re-exported it to America and the former colonies. So we're a kind of hinterland between those two cultures. And if you think of the sociologists that the world knows who are British, really, people like Giddens did that, I think, one could say quite clearly that was his career. And various other figures, I don't want to start to make enemies here, but there are various figures we could quite quickly list. Why is it that we don't have a Habermas? Why is it that we never produced a Bourdieu? Why is it that we don't have Foucault's? Why do we engage in synthesis more? Is it a language problem, the fact that we're English?
Probably. I think Brian's account there is pretty interesting, and it's one that I would significantly go along with. And of course, what it does is to demonstrate the importance of the movement of ideas, and then their reconfiguration, their repackaging, the central role of certain publishing houses, such as the one that we're surrounded with by here, to kind of sort of organize and effect that process. I think there was some. I think that's important. I mean, I'm not totally sure that, but however, I do think there are a couple of very significant figures who your account didn't refer to. That's Zygmunt Bauman, who seems to be an utterly significant and
also a Pole.
Also a Pole. Yeah. Well. Actually, the point about being a Pole is interesting because you remember that famous article by Tom Nairn on the origins of British national culture, which showed the incredible number of significant intellectual figures operating in Britain, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, I suppose.
Baldemus and people that no one talks about anymore. Mannheim, Baldemus and people.
But also that book, that article documented a huge array, also in many different subjects, not just in sociology. Sure. So the significance of the sort of the émigré, the person migrating here, it was probably actually pretty significant, much more generally. And Zygmunt is obviously a kind of fantastically interesting example of that. The other person I was going to say, which also has a similar story, is Stuart Hall. Also, of course, a migrant to the UK. Those two figures seem to me to be, have a very powerful and strong kind of voice of their own. And it's interesting, as you say, that they're neither of them originally British. But on the other hand, they did all their work in Britain, so I think that's
Ernest Gellner would be another one.
Ernest Gellner, for sure, yeah.
Well, one other thing that strikes me about the subject, because in my publishing role I have to do quite a lot of traveling, British sociology is still more amateurish than the Americans in terms of the professionalization of the subject. Their conference, this is a very professional conference, but their conference has 4,000 or 5,000 people. There's also far more specialization in America. People will be a macro sociologist but look at a particular thing. It might be class, it might be race, and nothing else. Or they may simply look at research methodologies and never really engage with what we would call substantive issues. Why is that would you agree, first of all, and secondly, why is that professionalization difference there? Why is it in place?
Yeah, I totally agree that, and of course the American Sociological Association meetings are held in these great fancy corporate hotels, the Marriott or the Hilton or both of them. They're, as you say, with hundreds of different events going on, huge plenary events in rooms 2 or 3 or 4 times as big as this one, involving often attracting to those events sort of super well-known public figures. Last time I remember going and hearing Naomi Klein speaking to 3,000 or 4,000 sociologists, and it was a phenomenal event. So there's something about this, scale, organisation, wealth probably makes a difference. Also, the way that event is a special event which most American sociologists tend to go to that and not to lots of other things. There's also a job market and obviously a market for getting your stuff published, etc., etc. So there's the way they put together in one site or in two hotels a lot of things. But also, of course, it's, you know, the staff of the ASA, there are, I think, 20 or 30 staff, and it's a sort of big organisation.
Yeah.
It's also fascinating, I mean, because they have these enormously elaborate prize givings you've probably been to, and people come and give their Oscar speeches and start crying and sobbing and thanking their mums and dads and so on, and their research team and so on. So the whole thing is, well, to me, utterly bizarre, kind of. It's good to visit as anthropologists, so I do an anthropology of this kind of event. So I think there's some of the reasons why that's come to develop. I just, what should the BSA do? And I think very energetic efforts have been made to engender more sense of excitement and activity over the last few years in the BSA, which I think is great. I suppose one of the things I was thinking about the BSA meetings I went to in the 70s, which were, as I say, it sort of seemed to matter what the topic was and who was speaking and what they had to say and what people thought of what they said. So it had a certain significance to the audience and so on. As far as I know, I mean, I was just kind of young guy and really know what was going on very much, but I sort of, it seemed like it was very important what happened there, and that if people had some new and interesting and important theory or program of research, they wanted to have it featured in the BSA. It was really important to them, and I don't think I have that sense now.
There's a much stronger tradition in America, too, of the academy and being an activist. So you're a sociologist by day, but you go out and you look after rights issues in the afternoon. That tradition exists to a degree in the UK, and during the feminist period it was more prominent. But would you say it's wilted a bit here?
Oh, well, I totally agree that sort of loosely old and new social movements are incredibly important in forming the nature, character, interests, and competence of sociological work. So, obviously, roughly speaking, social class, the working class, was the sort of animating force behind a lot of early sociology, or the effects of the Depression on various itinerant groups in American cities in the Chicago school, the Chicago period, and so on. And then I think it actually is pretty interesting from the 60s onwards, the proliferation of new social movements, to use that sort of phrase, and that each of those came to generate a kind of new sociology. Actually think that's a very significant issue. I sort of sometimes wonder if you don't have a new social movement behind you, are you going to get much traction in terms of changing and transforming sociological debate and so on? And so I don't know about exactly whether there are lots of activists in the afternoon or whatever, and I don't know how it compares with the United States. But I suppose the area that I'm most interested in now, which is sort of loosely the environment and resources and energy, obviously there's lots of that's intimately intertwined with a lot of kind of NGO activism. And it's it's not that people are necessarily doing both of those things, but they're certainly kind of forming academic debates in the light of some of those processes. In fact, I think the most impressive analyses of the thing that bothers me now, that's sort of the peaking of oil that I was talking about in the previous session, is the transition towns movement, which is kind of informed by academic literature, but in which many, there's some really interesting books and analyses which are actually probably better than social scientists are currently producing in the UK. So I think that, and in fact that gets away from the idea of simple users of research who are kind of sitting out there waiting to pluck at some findings that we've generated. And I think I much more prefer a sort of model of a kind of, organic intellectuals is a bit pretentious maybe, but sort of something a bit more like that sort of model of the relationship between academic activity, academic outputs, and sort of various kinds of movements.
When you come across a social event in Britain which dislocates the culture, like a riot, the media presentation of the riot involves journalists debating what actually happened, psychologists saying a little bit about the psychology of it all, maybe the economists saying, well, it's all down to the recession. Why are there never any sociologists in these panels, or hardly ever? I have a, while you're thinking.
Oh, yeah. Well, tell us the answer to your question.
I have a pet, well, how can I express this? When I go to dinner parties and I'm introduced and they say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a professor of sociology, I also publish sociology. There's a shudder of pity because people find our writing impenetrable. And if you look at leading public intellectuals who are psychologists, who are economists, who people know, people like Danny Blanchflower, the economist, who's a very good economist, he writes in an extremely accessible way. In our field, I mean, if I'm thinking of a quasi-sociologist who writes, well, I immediately think of someone like Naomi Klein, who's not really a sociologist, but writes sociologically in a very interesting way. If I look at the books on the Sage stand or on other stands, it's assumed that you're familiar with the vocabulary, the terminology, the key debates. So in a sense, the language is cutting us off from the public, in my view, to a certain degree. Would you have any thought about that?
Yeah, I do think that. I mean, the sort of books that I've been recently reading in sort of popular science on changing climate, energy, and so on, I think some of them are absolutely brilliant books. Fred Pearce, who probably some of you know the work of, a book called With Speed and Violence, which is an account of cataclysmic climate change, and also a significant contributor in Guardian. And he's a kind of, quotes, proper scientist, and he has developed a career as a scientific journalist. And it's absolutely right to say it would be great if there was a whole battery of social scientific journalists who wrote significant books. I suppose Malcolm Gladwell, Tipping Point, is sort of close to that, but he's an American guy. So there aren't many examples. Again, Mark Linus, who writes the book 6 Degrees, who's a British-based popular writer, but again, it's more in the science field.
You were telling me about that book, The Shallows, yesterday. Is that written by a sociologist?
No.
Can you say a bit? They may not know the book.
The Shallows, the shallowing of experience engendered by living life on the screen, and a kind of trenchant advocacy. That you want me to say this because it's all about the desirability of books as opposed to learning on screen, and how learning on screen produces shallower, less significant, less worked through, less well remembered kind of memory and cognitive experience, and indeed there are some apparently brain effects, as opposed to reading a proper book, not necessarily published by Sage from beginning to end, in which you go backwards and forwards and so on, all the sorts of things that folks of my generation tend to think are rather nice about books. So, he's I don't know, an English literature academic, I think. So actually promoting social science journalism would be a really, really good thing. And if there were such folks, to encourage their participation in the BSA and other events would be really, really good. Of course, actually, in the 1970s and 80s, there was this really, really excellent journal, New Society. Yeah. Many of you here will know that was a weekly journal, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was weekly.
Weekly journal, and it was about social science, research and theory, and sort of all the, quotes, big names of the time would have pieces, relatively short but interesting piece in it. It had the latest research findings. And actually the disappearance of that is really a significant loss. And that would have been a place where social science type journalists would have kind of prospered. But I mean, on the other hand, I actually think that the notion that there are social causes and social consequences, to put it very crudely, of many different kinds of events in the contemporary world actually is pretty widespread. And, it's not hard to find that sort of view on, many TV and radio and newspaper reports and accounts and analysis. So I think a sort of loosely sociological understanding, a sort of non-biological and even sometimes a non-economistic understanding is sort of present, and I think trying to get that a bit more energized is obviously really significant.
Let's go back to the 70s. You were saying these themes were coming out which were giving British sociology a face within the country and perhaps globally: class, feminism, Marxism, debates around the state. Key themes were emerging.
Yeah.
And then along comes postmodernism.
Oh, yes.
So what do you think the effect of postmodernism has been on British sociology?
Right. Yes, and also along came Thatcher and Reagan.
Yeah.
Actually, probably more significant. And it's interesting, obviously we now call this transformation probably beginning with Pinochet regime in Chile in 1973, the development of neoliberalism as the Chicago boys spilled out from the economics department at the University of Chicago and kind of took over the world, as Naomi Klein brilliantly analyzes, I think. The development, I think there was, actually I think there were lots of contested understandings during the 1980s of what was going on, because there was also a lot of analysis of the flexibilization of labor markets, which sociologists made a significant contribution to. There was the debates and literature around Marxism today and Stuart Hall and that kind of group that were interested in what were the sort of significance. And it was sort of kind of morphed into aspects of postmodern debates, but I think it was sort of more grounded, and it was grounded to some significant degree in the concept of Thatcherism, which was, I suppose, how neoliberalism was kind of understood at the time. Scott Lash and I wrote this book called The End of Organised Capitalism in 1987 that was, again, although it had quite a lot about postmodern cultures in it, it was obviously a much more it was meant to be a much more sort of grounded book in terms of changing shift from nation-state society to a sort of globalizing capitalism. Yeah. So I haven't really answered your question.
Postmodernism in particular, I think, is interesting because it really swept aside some established positions. I remember when I was in Leicester in the 70s, there was a lecturer who was a fairly zealous Marxist who would say to me at the beginning of the year, "It's going to happen on February the 4th. And I'd say, "What?" And he said, "Well, the revolution is going to happen on February the 4th this year. All of these signs point that way." And there was a kind of certainty and confidence which, for a 21-year-old person, seemed utterly preposterous. This man should be in a lunatic asylum, I kept thinking when that was happening. And along comes postmodernism, and everything's thrown in the air. And you and Scott tried to to rescue a kind of interest in substance with concepts like de-differentiation. I don't know if you would own that or Scott would own it, but it was at that time I associate with both of your works.
Yeah.
You were saying things, the boundaries are breaking down, the barriers are breaking down, but there is still a sense in which we have to rationally understand what is going on. Now, from certain postmodern perspectives, that was an irrational response to the whole thing. And what happened at that point was this huge injection into not just British sociology, but perhaps more than any other sociology, this huge injection of interest in representation, discourse, coding. Don't do empirical things because it's all relative. Look at the sign, don't look at the substance. What was going on then? And would you agree with that? Or do you think it's too much of a caricature?
No, I think that was pretty significant. I mean, I suppose I always made this very simple distinction between the sociology of the postmodern and postmodern thinking. And Scott and I were much keener on the idea of the sort of the sociology of kind of postmodern cultural changes and forms and so on. So that's what we were seeking to engender and examine. But obviously there was a hugely significant sort of cultural turn and huge interest in a lot of particularly sort of French literature and writing and so on about representation and discourse, and in which sort of discourses were huge debates about what was the nature of a discourse and so on. I think that was all sort of overstated. And actually, one thing that was powerfully missing, although of course this is a very interesting period, was the financial reorganization that took place across the world during the 1980s, the so-called Big Bang in the City of London, and many other of the rules which regulated and prevented the proliferation and circulation of financial entities being significantly removed in that period. And so in a way, the systems of finance were becoming systems of finance were being kind of hived off and separated from kind of real economies and real processes. So that's why Scott and I then partly why we then wrote another book, Economy as Signs. But it was an economy of signs, not just the signs were linked to a whole variety of very powerful and significant processes. But I don't think we quite realized, well, we didn't remotely realize just how important that set of processes were to become. And I don't think enough analysis was made of these, let's call them financial, these forms of finance, which became relatively separate from the real economy. I don't think we collectively did remotely enough to examine that.
It's interesting because hearing you speak there, at that time in the 70s and 80s, a lot of interest was in the regulatory state and how the state would intervene and how, and what you're saying is the state participated in massive deregulation. It was actually deregulating left, right and center at that time.
Absolutely. At least in beginning in, probably beginning in Chile, but certainly in the US and the UK was this whole-scale programs of deregulation. Obviously, privatizing various sorts of state activities, the reorganizing of state activities so they were less subject to democratic control and the proliferation of kind of democratic deficit, which was, I've been reading a lot on the sort of reading a certain amount on the kind of the history of environmental politics and the way in which the so-called American conservative movement reorganized itself after the 60s to undermine, disrupt, question both the kind of the science, but also the kinds of forms of regulation and intervention that had occurred, obviously, in the US in the 1960s and early 1970s. There was both sort of environmental regulation, also the consumer rights movement was very interesting in that, you know, Ralph Nader, many of you will know of, very important. And that was, there was a whole process of seeking to orchestrate the dismantling of that. And that, you know, significantly came to pass in the Reagan years. And I don't think, well, I certainly didn't understand any of that. And I don't know that many of the rest of us sort of working at the time quite understood just, I mean, Scott and I called it, you know, disorganized capitalism, but that was a kind of not really quite capturing.
There was a kind of imprecision, which maybe is quite deep in British sociology. We haven't really got a Chicago school in our tradition. And in the kind of discussion that you've been going through just now about that moment of financial deregulation, it was discussed as a moment of financial deregulation. It wasn't discussed as what is Ford doing, what is IBM doing, what is the corporation doing. In a sense, even now, the corporation is a kind of anonymous agent, and the assumption is that all corporations act in the same way, which of course they don't. The other thing that's happened, I think, at this time, which sociologists weren't talking a lot about, cultural theorists were talking more about it, is how the new capitalism, what Jim McGuigan calls cool capitalism, learned from the counter-revolutionary movements, from the counterculture. He said, listen to the consumer, make sure you care about the environment. People like Richard Branson is a billionaire from doing that, and he still proceeds with classic capitalist aims in mind, which is to achieve a monopoly for Virgin. I remember being in San Diego when the Indian Ocean tsunami occurred, and it was in my hotel room, and Richard Branson was being interviewed live, and he was saying, Virgin Air Fleet will make Virgin commodities available to help these people. We'll send Virgin special. He was advertising Virgin as well as giving resources to the tsunami, because the whole 3 or 4 minute interview was just littered with references to Virgin. Now, that kind of interest in the different modalities of corporate capitalism, we haven't really latched into that. I'm not sure that anyone else has, but we don't have studies of what is it about Apple Mac that makes them so, in quotes, sexy. They behave in a traditional capitalist mode, and yet, why aren't we looking at that? If sociology is about observation, why aren't we observing how these corporate agents operate?
Two things I want to say. One is, of course, a lot of the interest in what happens in economies and even the sort of the cultural practices and activities of giant corporations, and of course has become migrated into business schools. And it's actually interesting to think, I mean, there were pretty well-known business management schools in the UK in the 1960s, I guess. There were a few little departments in, I guess, Warwick and Lancaster when it set up, had some management departments. But this powerful competitor, actually, academic competitor, much more powerful than, in a sense, social science has become, that didn't really exist on any scale. And there was the idea in Oxford or Cambridge or LSE having a management business school was kind of absolutely not the sort of thing that they would do. So it's sort of interesting to think about that. And so some of that work, at least, has migrated into those entities. And I think the relationship that we have with the folks who are doing that sort of work in management schools is probably something that ought to be kind of thought about a bit, actually. So that'd be one point. The second point is that, actually, of course, and this relates really, actually those are difficult entities to research.
They're private.
They're private, yeah. And of course, if you're in a business school, it's probably easier to research than if you're kind of a sort of a jobbing sociologist.
But is there a deeper problem about what we actually do, and it might not be limited to British sociology? I mean, typically when we come across the question of what is the corporation doing, we start with the abstract, not the concrete. Now, common sense tells you to start from the concrete and build to the abstract. We start by saying the corporation is a representation of capitalism, and that's what the corporation does. We don't actually look at the different modalities, the different variations. Is that something that British sociology is not very good at, or would you say that sociology in general is not very good at?
I think sociology is not very good at doing that, but actually I think it's to do with how do you access such entities. When obviously a lot of, I mean, there's a whole literature in the past on, how to study power. I actually edited a book once called Power in Britain, and it was quite ridiculous book in a way, because most of the time you couldn't possibly study it, and of course it's even more difficult to study now. I actually wondered about doing a sort of another edition of that, because it's a good title, but the actual thing is so difficult to do. And as Robert Moore and I were discussing over coffee, the significant problem of tax and tax avoidance and tax evasion, offshoring of activities, the sorts of ways in which that happens on a huge scale. So those activities and the kind of the recomposition, restructuring of companies, sort of in part to do, or significantly in part to do with the presenting different kinds of taxable income in different jurisdictions, the significance of secrecy jurisdictions, which are hugely significant, we now know, partly through journalists and WikiLeaks and so on. WikiLeaks, I think, is a pretty important source in a lot of this. So actually there are lots of ways that those things have to be studied, which are very difficult to study. And I kind of wondered, how to get a research ethics committee to approve breaking into the headquarters or the of companies based in the Cayman Islands to engage in sort of subterfuge, photocopying of papers, illegal downloading of materials, etc., etc.
Some people would say unless we do that, we end up with a kind of soft sociology, but I don't want to go into that. What I want to go into instead is another British dimension that we haven't talked about at all, and you're very well qualified to do that, which is the auditing, the audit culture that's developed in this country. We'll come to the end in 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
John was head of the research panels, the last two, I think, wasn't it?
No, 1996 and 201.
201, sorry. What effect has that had, the auditing process, on British sociology?
Well, I'm going to be very unpopular, because I would say it's had a good effect.
Right.
Or rather, it's had a better effect than if that hadn't happened. So, for example, there are studies that have been done to look at UK higher education levels of attainment using citation data done by this company, Evidence, which shows that the sort of standing and rating of British academic institutions has gone up significantly since the first RAE that was held in 1986. A little known fact, actually. 1986 was the first, and since then the sort of position, and the UK per capita, you have to do it obviously per standardized academic or something, has gone up since then. And so if you're trying to say what's happened. But the other reason I think it's extremely important is a kind of boring point about funding. Actually, the best funding in the UK is so-called QR funding. The funding that goes to pay not for projects, but for sort of research infrastructure and for reducing the time, at least of those people working in departments which have got good levels of QR income. I think that's really a significant thing, and the research councils, of course, would probably like to take all that away and to run it themselves, and it would be a much more project-based form of funding. So pretty well all the books that I've ever written have been generated from QR funding, not from any specific project funding. And if I get project funding, the book, if I do publications, they don't seem to do nearly as well. So, which is kind of interesting.
It's an interesting moment in British sociology. I mean, £9,000 fees are just around the corner, and I think they will be nearly universally £9,000 fees that we'll be asking sociology students to charge. Increase contact time, or at least an attempt within universities to have more face-to-face relationships with students. Students who are wanting knowledge in a very instrumental way, who can't see the point often of social theory, you know, dead Europeans, why should we look at Weber, Marx, all these people? Give us some reasons to be optimistic about sociology.
Right. Well, of course, most of those points you just referred to pertain to pretty well do pertain to all subjects which we might be kind of quotes competing with. I don't think we're in a particularly better or worse position than some others. However, and I suppose there are ways in which sociology has kind of moved into a number of areas in a very clever sort of way, I think. Moved into criminology, moved into health research and health studies. It's also obviously central to media and cultural studies, so that it's actually quite cleverly positioned itself in relationship to quite significant numbers of people, quite important.
Organisation studies would be another.
Organisation studies, yeah. I think the really clever thing is to think what the new thing will be, actually. What is the new sort of area that sociology should be kind of moving into a relationship with, and in which there will be, really important debates, really important sets of new students.
Well, we know, John, we know what that is. That's the big society, isn't it? So what do you want to say about the big society?
Yeah, well, funny enough, Monday I was at a conference in Lancaster on the big society and technology. So there's a whole bunch of computer scientists who were already in big society. Obviously, people will have been following this debate about AHRC and its funding of big society programs. Well, I definitely think that it's probably quite a good idea to
take it seriously.
Take it seriously. To engage with it. Yeah. I don't have any problems about doing that. But of course, to do so in a appropriately critical and reflexive sort of way. But actually, I think there are one or two other areas, actually, where there may well be ways in which sociology is or should further get kind of tied in with other developments. One of those is the one I've got a bit involved in, that's climate change and issues of energy resources. And there's a BSA climate change study group recently formed, that kind of thing. And of course there will be, there are already probably significant numbers of new courses. There may well be universities are in some ways rebranding themselves as sustainable. I've just been to meetings in Lancaster all about can we reconfigure the whole curriculum around issues of sustainability across all subjects. I was kind of completely amazed by that. So that's one kind of thing. And I suppose the other area is internet and the virtual and the digital and new media and so on. And that's again where there's lots of very important social science research, often collaboratively being done with computer scientists and so on. And I think there are probably pretty interesting ways in which, that's kind of a future or the future. And, kind of developing and connecting and making sure that there are good positive connections there, which of course, both of those areas are kind of not just social, they're social and material. And I think the kind of material turn is a very important sort of turn over the last decade or so. very much influenced by some debates in science studies, and also, and I suppose, in kind of consumption studies, and to some extent in the mobilities turn I've been involved in, and so on. So I think there are quite a lot of pretty interesting developments, and I think it's what people should not do is to be stuck where they were. And so I think the big threat is actually the declining number of new posts in British universities, which will follow from the uncertainty about funding and the cuts.
And the abolition of retirement.
Well, some older folks can do new things. You can teach an old dog new tricks. Actually, I don't agree with that at all. But I don't think that's going to affect the appointment of new people, but actually trying to engender opportunities for new appointments, and assuming new people are mobilizing new areas. And actually, I think when departments try to reproduce themselves, that's hugely problematic. They should be seeking to appoint in the new, latest areas, and that often means having to probably ditch some older areas.
We've moved from audit culture, we've gone on to class, we've talked about Americanization and the response to that. There aren't many figures who can do that without turning a hair, and John is one of them. Very rich conversation. Thanks, John. Shall we open it up?
Sure, yeah.
It's working. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. That was an absolutely excellent conversation covering so much time of British sociology. As Chris Rojek was saying, there are questions from the audience. If you want to stick your hands up, someone will come down with a roving mic. If you could maybe say your name and where you're from as well. Incidentally, I'm Chris Yeo from the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, BSA Executive. I forgot to say that, as one should. But please do that, and someone will come and go off your mic. I think the conference member over there, yeah, thanks. And then John Brewer after
Thanks very
that.
much, I enjoyed that. Ian Pritchard, University of Chester. I'm currently working in the sports science department, and my colleagues, my sports sociology colleagues, all worship at the altar of Norbert Elias. So I was just wondering how you would assess Elias and figurationalism's contribution to British sociology since 1945.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, you do.
I was at Leicester, so perhaps it's better for me to start with that. They're a bit clubby. They are a group that talk to themselves, I think, too much. They don't open up to an audience like this. They have their own meetings. They're also getting older and not bringing newer people in. There are not many younger people that come to figurational meetings. They're all tending to be towards the retirement age. Eric Dunning, 74, Menela's retiring, Hoedsbloem, who was here yesterday, maybe here now, it's still somewhere. There's a real danger that it will just be a sectarian group, and I think underlying the whole project, if there is a project, is reorientating sociology in general. The process concepts that Elias developed are meant to apply to all sociology, not just to what figurational sociology people do. And they haven't, I mean, they did in sport with the hooligan thing get involved in, as it were, issues of substance to ordinary people. But that's not necessarily one of their great strengths in terms of the publications that emerge from them. So that's what I would say off the top of my head. I don't know if you've got anything to add.
No, not really. I agree with everything you say. I mean, it's not influenced me very much. I've read a few books. It's sort of interesting. I suppose when I read the Manners book, what am I trying to say?
But Civilizing Process?
Civilized Process, yeah. Was absolutely riveting book. Couldn't believe it, and I started immediately. I was teaching first year sociology at the time, so I started introducing all sorts of things about knives and forks and spoons into the part one lecture, which didn't go down very well, but I thought that was absolutely fantastic, but I haven't much followed the later debates.
Okay, John Brewer next, and then delegate down the front in the red.
John Brewer, University of Aberdeen. But I suspect I'm replying on this occasion as president of the BSA. I think I'd like to make a few points. The first is that we have to understand, I think, the scale of sociology in Britain. We're much smaller than German sociology, as we heard yesterday from Ulrich Beck. We're much, much, much smaller than American sociology, and yet we punch dramatically above our weight. The most recent ESRC international benchmarking exercise indicated that we are second to the States. And when you consider how small we are, I think that's actually a more important measure than comparing the experience of a BSA conference with an ASA conference, because we're always going to be much smaller, much poorer. But can I also say that in some respects, the BSA conference is a prisoner of the growth of the BSA. Because it used to be the case, and I was a student in the 70s too, it used to be the case that the annual conference was the place, the only place, the place where you went. These days, we have about 43 study groups. Many of those study groups put on their own study group conferences. We no longer invest everything in this one single event. Now, that impacts on the nature of this event, but it's a measure, I think, of how British sociology has grown. And can I also say that we need to appreciate, I think, the openness of British sociology. Now, I mean that in a few respects. We're open in terms of our national borders. You've alluded to the fact that the diaspora has had a tremendous impact on British sociology. You know, the early East European diaspora at the beginning of the 20th century, the South Africans, the Coens, the Rexes, the East Europeans, both post-Second World War and more recently. But we're open not just in terms of our borders, we're open in terms of our ideas. You just simply don't get discussions in American sociology based upon, excuse me, European continental social theory. You wouldn't find a discussion of Foucault or Bourdieu. I remember being at a conference in Toronto, the big USA criminology conference. I started to talk about the negative impact of postmodernism on the practice of ethnography. Somebody asked me, a very, very well-established, experienced ethnographer who I won't name, what is postmodernism? And that was 1998. So we're open in terms of our ideas as well. And can I suggest that the absence of the British grand theorist, well, true, it is a measure of the nature of British sociology, but you undersell what I think has been the tremendous strength of British sociology. And the tremendous strength of British sociology is that it's been mixed method. So we're not dominated, as American sociology is, by quantitative methods, but more so we're middle-range theory. If you look at the classic studies that have shaped British sociology, they're middle-range theories. The black-coated worker, Rex and Moore, Wilmot and Young, the Luton car worker studies. They're books that addressed middle-range theory as well as what you might call substantive topic. So that means two things. It means we can't characterize British sociology as applied sociology, as somehow having been co-opted into the policy-orientated impact debate, because our major contribution has been indeed to mid-range theory. And can I also suggest that another measure of the strength of British sociology is not just that journalists ignore us, it is that we have contributed to an educated citizenry. Through the expansion of sociology from the 1960s onwards, sociology has contributed to an educated citizenry, a civil society in which sociological ideas...
Thank you, John.
Last point. In which sociological ideas are discussed as a matter of routine. Ordinary people talk about globalization, for example.
Thanks, John.
And apologies for going on for too long.
No, it's okay. So I was getting mixed up. I was back at TEC conference there. 3 minutes to speak. Okay, do you want to come back?
I think that's robust, and I agree with most of what you said there, John, but there are problems with what you said. If you're completely right that sociology, in a sense, has been more successful than we give ourselves credit for, you do hear John Humphreys using words like charisma, globalization, even postmodernism in the morning on the Today program. But in a sense, it leaves a problem for us. What do we talk about if all of them out there are using our concepts? Often in ways that we would not want them to be used. People talk about pop stars as having charisma. That's not Weber's term at all. Charisma is a revolutionary force, not a glamorous force. So there's a problem with that. And there's also another problem with the success of sociology, which John alluded to. There are loads of sociologists in business studies, organization studies, health and illness. That leaves sociology departments relying on theory and research methods as the main areas. Those are the two areas I find which are least popular with students. So the sociology departments themselves have been abandoned in some ways by these applied areas. The action in applied sociology is not necessarily occurring in sociology departments. It's occurring in health and illness departments or in leisure studies departments or tourist studies. So that's what I would say, but John?
I mean, I think you're both right and wrong. I agree about the point about punching above the weight, which is also borne out by that citation data, for example, that I also briefly alluded to. I also very much agree with the notion of openness, and I once described this in an article at the 30th BSA conference when I described sociology as a parasite, a metaphor I don't think was quite brilliantly chosen.
It's a leaf, isn't it?
But I think that was trying to bring out the ways in which there are changing relationships between different disciplines. We should not think that the neighbouring discipline are fixed and given, and that there may well be interests and topics and concerns that neighbouring disciplines kind of extrude, and therefore sociology can provide a kind of I had this sort of metaphor of a field as well, of a kind of field of encounter with the bits that other disciplines extrude. So I think thinking about the changing relationships there is quite important. And I completely agree about the wonderful effects of the internationalizing of students and staff that has taken place across British sociology. In fact, that's one of the things to make a very strong... In the 70s, the only people from other countries in most departments were the odd American, like Scott. But now, obviously now they're... and in fact, I suppose there's a Europeanization. It's particularly striking, or a little bit Asianization, but particularly the growth of European colleagues from different European countries becoming colleagues in departments and so on. And
new ethnicities.
And new, absolutely, yes. Yeah. So, and indeed, the decline in the sort of maleness of most departments has been a profoundly good thing. Anyway, so that's all. I also agree very much about the significance of the sort of middle range writing. I don't think there's been, I don't know whether, I mean, there is relatively little sort of abstracted theory on the one hand, except some of the debates in the 70s around Althusser and Poulantzas were pretty abstracted theory, and to some degree not so much abstracted empiricism. But there was one thing John referred to, which is interesting, which you referred to books. And you said, oh, you listed a whole series of books. And I suppose I could give a little plug for, not this book, but books. I think actually one of the reasons why British sociology has done quite well, maybe better than it should have done for its size, is because of the very productive relationship that it has enjoyed with various publishing houses, which I suppose are mostly centred in London, centred in the UK, that have sought to develop and publish, decent books, look nice, sell well, sell globally. And so the relationship with Sage or with Polity or Taylor and Francis and some newer ones, Macmillan's, Ashgate and so on, I think that's a very important sort of set of connections there. And actually books are very important. I now become a bit of a bore about the significance of books, writing for books, the scale of argument that can be presented in a book as opposed to what is only available in a 7,000 or 8,000 word paper. So I'm very keen on that. And I think it's a nice thing to think about the 1980s, which were a sort of dark time of British social science. There were two very interesting things were initiated in that period. One was the establishment of Polity Press, predominantly organised around social theory. Well, that's a pretty odd thing to develop in 1980. And also Theory, Culture and Society in Mike Featherstone's garage in Middlesbrough. Again, a pretty odd thing to think of developing. And then setting up this...
There is a happy marriage between publishing and British sociology, because I've had this twin-track career between being an academic and a publisher at the same time. And in publishing, what they say is that if you're based in Britain and you publish books, Britain isn't your market. The English-speaking world is your market. And therefore, the kind of books you take on cannot be about crime in Teesside and cannot be about crime or divorce in Reading. They have to be globally interesting to a non-British audience. And I think that's actually been strengthening for British sociology. If you look again at America, and I don't want to make it America versus us, they are incredibly introspective in what they publish. They are very narrow in their interests in terms of the publication. I think Stephen Turner might be here, and he may disagree with me tremendously, but they don't talk. They make concessions about talking to global themes and cosmopolitan themes, but actually they don't talk about them very much. Their interest is American society, and there are 310 million of them, and so they can happily just publish their books for that market. We cannot do that. We have to go global, otherwise we won't be listened to.
Okay, thank you very much. There's probably time left for 3 more people who have identified who want to speak. So the delegate in the red, delegate in the blue, and the delegate in the brown. We might try and get some other questions in, but please wear colour-coded clothing to make it easier. So if you
Hello.
yeah.
This is on. Yes, my name's Ken Riley. Many years retired now. Last job, helping set up the sociology department of the University of the Islands and Islands, over which Robert Moore presided. I'm a child of Stephen Cockgrove at Bath. Remember Science of Society and that empirical tradition to which had been referred on. I was an active member of these association meetings over the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot of overt and crypto-Marxism, as well you know. I look back on that and think it was a lot of fun, but a waste of time. So my question is, do you agree with that? And are there any contemporary examples in sociology which you think people are having a lot of fun, but a waste of time?
In some respects, I think Marxism is more relevant than ever before. And I'm not a Marxist at all, but I think some of the ideas are very, very fruitful for understanding the recession, the global crisis, pollution, and various other issues. I liked postmodernism at the start. But I now see postmodernism as a ground-clearing exercise. It was ground-clearing in the sense that there were very entrenched positions. This man who in Leicester University was predicting the working class revolution to me, that had to be got rid of because it was just not realistic. And there are other ones that we can talk about. But postmodernism, I think, has also led to a kind of spaciness in the subject, a lack of a clear agenda of what we should collectively be doing, given too much emphasis to issues of representation, discourse, coding, rather than inequality, pollution. John's work is now really talking about really substantive things in climate change. So I wouldn't see Marxism or crypto-Marxism now as the problem. I can see why you might have said that in the 70s, because they were going somewhat on a different trajectory. But I'm more ambivalent about the influence of postmodernism on British sociology.
Me too.
John.
Yeah, I roughly agree with all of that, and I'm very sure now that the kinds of modes of analysis that Marx, not necessarily Marxists, talked about have a lot of lessons. I see Marx as a sort of crypto complexity theorist, sort of a complexity theorist before his time, something that some complexity writers have also now tried to argue for. So in terms of thinking about the properties of the self-expanding, but also the contradictory properties of systems, I actually think Marx's analysis in Capital, or even briefly, I think the Communist Manifesto is an absolutely brilliant piece of social science. It's absolutely stunning, and many of the sorts of debates and literatures about modernity, communications, transport, the forming of a class in and for itself, and so on, are all brilliantly
And totally readable.
And totally readable, absolutely, yeah.
Well, right.
Yeah. So that
the way the British sociology took it on, and you've made the point really, didn't get into the spirit of those ideas really, got on a different track, which was unfruitful.
Yes. Well, I think some of the debates in the Birmingham School and then in the Stuart Hall University, kind of in the debate with and around the brilliant book by E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's not in sociology, but it's an absolutely fantastic book about the making of a class. And I think we should have been doing parallel or analogous sorts of analyses, and I don't think any of us did. And actually, that's just one little point. I'd say that one of the problems, I think, of the current situation is the dumbing down of the PhD, the reduced length, and I think that's absolutely diabolical. And one of the things that is being brought about by that, has been the difficulty of people developing kind of large-scale macro projects in their PhDs. And if people don't have time and energy to do that in their PhDs, they're unlikely to find that in the sort of more audit monitoring culture that comes later. Yeah. And, once upon a time, most people who did PhDs published them. Of course, they were pretty, who did them and finished them and so on, actually then they were published because they were major pieces of research. And I think that's really hard to do these days.
Okay, thank you, John. If we could try and get the last two questions in quite quickly and everything. So, yes.
Okay. Albert Zheng, I'm a University of Warwick, a PhD student from Taiwan. I want to give some feedback to the discussion from the perspective of international student. Actually, several years ago, I had the option to choose to go to America or come to UK. And that time, most of the Taiwanese students choose to go to America. Yeah. So I too take a 1 month trip across North American continent, visiting 8 different institutions. I met more than a dozen scholars there and 20 more postgraduate students. I have long talk with them, and my conclusion is that I choose to come to UK. There were 3 reasons behind my decision. First is that those people I met always tell me that the only thing you have to think about if you go there is to publish your article on professional journals. And I think that's very, very, it's not part of my professional aspiration. Second is I found that the scholar there, yes, we all know that American sociology is highly specialized, highly professionalized, but it has, seems to me, become little smaller circles in which even the sociologists do not really talk to each other. I remember a scholar from Harvard told me that after she went there, she rarely had any chance to have any serious intellectual dialogue with her colleague. And thirdly is that I found that even in the most prestigious department, the ratio of international students is still below 30% usually, or far more below. And the agenda is dominated by study of American society. Even when there was some study about Asia or some other places, but it's done from the perspective of American perspective, American interest. So at the time, in comparison, I found that because I'm interested in the discussion about globalization, so I just run my risk, come to LSE, do my master here, and I found this is in the end, I found that's a very, very good choice for me. I think that the strengths of British sociology, in one sense, happen to be its limited size. Probably we have to consider what is the adequate size for an intellectual community, academic community. If you got too large, probably the level of specialization and differentiation will make dialogue impossible. And here I can find my desired fusion of visions is much more possible in this academia. And secondly, I will attribute it to it's a blessing from the declined power of Britain in the world. Probably because of the decline former colonial power in the world, I found that it seems to me that the academic here have a much more genuine interest in knowing about what is happening in other places. So I found that a particular strength of the Britain is to be the platform for many voices around the world to be heard. Thank you
very much, sir. And could you run the next question in as well, please, and maybe take on both of them, given that time is turning a bit tight. So if you'd like to ask it,
yeah.
Thank you.
Adrian Franklin, University of Tasmania. I'd like to bring what Ulrich Beck said yesterday into the conversation a bit, because he was talking about cosmopolitanization and suggesting that a kind of nationalistic orientation, which of course is implied by a British Sociological Association and British sociology, is increasingly less apposite for a world in which we are becoming, not just as he was saying, entangled with others and other processes and flows and all that sort of thing, but I mean broadening that out, I mean with objects and things and texts. And I think certainly I agree with John when he says that the science and technology studies has been one of the kind of great success stories into the leading edge, and I encourage just about every student that comes along to go into that. But then I was also thinking something that Zygmunt Bauman says. Often some of those things he says that don't seem to be going anywhere often strike you as very important later. He once was talking about the speed with which all of these entanglements impact on us actually produce a new social effect, a kind of confusion and inability to understand. And it leads to things like mixophobia, as he calls it. It's a horrible expression, but it's just a fear, really, that's born of not knowing what is going on around you, not being able to process it, not being able to kind of work out whether it's dangerous or whether it's a good thing or whatever. So, I mean, thinking about all of that, I'm just thinking, well, there seems to be an increasing role, actually, paradoxically maybe, for a British sociology to do that work, to kind of sort out and diagnose and explicate and make clear and write in a clear way and in an accessible way, because people are finding it extremely difficult to kind of be social.
Excellent, thanks very much. There's two questions on pretty much the same kind of theme in some respects. Gentlemen, you have 2 minutes to answer.
I mean, I think, Adrian, you're right. I think there is a kind, we shouldn't just look at sociology, we should look at the culture in which it's situated, which is the UK. And there is, I think, in UK life, it's well known, a tendency to be very reserved, tendency not to speak our minds very loudly. There's also quite a lot of anxiety about where we fit. It may come from our interest in class and our experience of class. And so I think this point about people not knowing in a changing world what to do and getting phobic about it is interesting. But one of the things that also comes through in current British life is with the cuts that we've suffered, which have been extensive cuts, there is a significant number of the population who aren't conservatives who say the cuts should have gone deeper. There is a kind of willingness in British life to be punished, it seems to me. And maybe that comes through in terms of some of the agendas that we've set within sociology over the years. I don't know. I'd have to think about it more. But what would you say? Not about that so much, but the point.
Yeah. Well, first of all, interested in the comments from the colleague from Taiwan, and I've supervised a number of PhDs from colleagues from Taiwan, which has worked out brilliantly well from my viewpoint. And the sort of, I think there's a sort of an informal, slightly less stuffy, slightly less pretentious culture of British university departments. And I think that was partly to do with, well, one of the reasons is because professors are not all powerful. And also because of the status of the category of lecturer, which doesn't exist in quite a lot of other university systems. People who are lecturers, full-time lecturers, have academic freedom and don't have to do what the professors or the head of department necessarily always say they want them to do. And so there's a sort of collegialism is, I suppose, what I was getting to. And I think hanging on to collegialism in troubled times is extremely important and significant thing to achieve. And to counterpose collegialism to managerialism is highly desirable. On Adrian's point, yes, I don't know that I have any views about phobias, but I do have views about futures. And I think futures are very interesting. And I think, as I was saying in the previous session in here, well, I think it's really, really important for us lot to be in the debates about social futures, not to understand social futures as reducible to technologies or as reducible to economic processes, but to be having a kind of very significant role in diagnosing and deciphering the interlocking relationships between the sort of the material, the technological, the discursive, and the social. And I do think, as a consequence of a variety of intellectual developments over the last few decades that we've skated around over this last hour or so, actually I think there is a sort of set of resources there that we could do well to draw on and develop, but it requires lots of hard work to do that, and lots of fighting for the resources and fighting for the collegiality that was just referring to as well.
Okay, John, thank you very much. I think it's a nice way to end it, talking about the future, but with the little reassurance of hard work that it'll take. So I'd like to thank John Urry and Chris Rojek for a very stimulating and interesting discussion about the past of British sociology, but also the future. So thank you very much again, and thank you for attending and asking your questions. Thank you very much.